Hi, everyone. Well, I'm really excited to be here today with Catherine Middlebrooks, who is a corrective postpartum exercise specialist and certified yoga teacher. And she's going to be teaching today about postpartum core and pelvic floor care. So I'm going to give the mic over to Catherine and see what she has to share with us.
Thank you, Ameya. Thank you so much for having me and letting me be a part of this discussion with your community. I'm excited to dive in. So I'll just speak a little bit about my background and then we can dive right in. Interrupt me at any time, ask me questions. Uh, my name's Catherine Middlebrooks. I'm the founder of BRB Yoga. I created BRB Yoga partly because of my experience postpartum. When my first daughter was born, I had been a yoga instructor for many, many years. And I kind of just jumped right back into regular yoga practice. And what I found was that over about 9 months after I had her, I was getting progressively weaker and weaker and having more and more physical issues pop up for me, despite feeling like, I had a relatively healthy birth. I had an easy pregnancy. I was lucky in all of those aspects. And yet, over time after the baby was born, I was getting weaker and weaker. And it turns out that many of the yoga poses that I was doing were actually making my core weaker. I had a diastasis recti that had been not properly diagnosed by my midwife. And over time, I was having lots of back pain, pelvic floor prolapse feeling, sort of this feeling that like my insides were just heavy and falling out. And it started me on this journey to understand, well, why didn't I know how to take care of myself? And what is it that we women need to do in order to be able to have our bodies heal physically so that we can do whatever sort of activity it is we love. Like I love yoga, I love hiking, I live in Colorado, I love to get outside. But for me, my goal is always that whatever woman I'm working with is able to get back to whatever brings them joy. So I work with women through yoga and corrective exercise to really help them rebuild their post-baby body so that it is strong and capable and able to do whatever it is that they want to do. I just never want to see a woman feeling limited or as if their body has betrayed them. I get a lot of that sort of language from women who feel like their body is not behaving in the way that they want it to. So what I thought I would start with today is just some of the common pitfalls that I see where people end up inadvertently doing things that end up making their body injured or have ongoing issues where maybe they could prevent that. Does that sound good?
That's awesome.
All right. So in general, the thing that I think is the most common issue that I see among postpartum women is that they do too much too soon after having a baby physically. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for this. One, we live in a culture where we give pregnant women a ton of information and a ton of support. And then it's like the baby arrives and see you later, you're on your own. You don't get a checkup until you're about 6 weeks postpartum. And then at that 6-week postpartum, they may or may not actually check your body. But most often what they'll do is say, okay, go ahead. You're clear for exercise. You can go do whatever you did before you got pregnant. And this is just really bad advice, if I'm being honest. Like we should not be telling women who have literally grown a baby for 10 months. Now that baby is gone. Their core muscles are weak. Their pelvic floor is either weak or overactive because it's trying to support where the core weakness is. We should not say, go do whatever you did before, because what ends up happening is these women with very weak cores end up going to run 5 miles or go to a CrossFit class or go to a power yoga class. And they take this body that's in a very vulnerable state and basically exert pressure on it that makes it more damaged and prevents it from healing. So the too much too soon, it happens very often. I think that it happens, as I said, because we don't take care of our women well. I think also we have some cultural issues in terms of the, celebrities showing off their bikini bodies at 6 weeks postpartum and all of that. It's just these unrealistic expectations that we are giving to women. So, very often when you dive into activity that is more than your body can handle in that postpartum period, what will happen is, whereas your body may have sort of healed naturally if you just allowed yourself to rest, did gentle exercise in those first few weeks and months postpartum, instead, you go out, you do too much. What ends up happening is, if you had a separation in your abdominal muscles, you can end up making it worse, constantly putting pressure out on it while you're doing your higher intensity activity. And that will end up creating sort of a diastasis or an abdominal separation that never goes away. Likewise, if you end up running really hard and your pelvic floor isn't ready for that level of demand, you can go from feeling like, I've got this sort of normal, I had a baby, my pelvic floor feels a little atypical. You can go beyond that and then actually have a sense, okay, now your organs are actually descending out of your body, which is a prolapse, simply because you're putting so much pressure onto a very weak muscle. So very often, it's the too much too soon that ends up creating these ongoing physical issues. Whereas if women were able to rest and do sort of targeted activities in those first few months postpartum designed to bring the body back into balance, they would most likely heal relatively naturally. They wouldn't have these ongoing issues. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And it's just amazing how little, when you go to the doctor, and just the postpartum, just how much little postpartum information they have, or knowledge or care that they give. And so that's something where we really see eye to eye, and just really grateful to have people who, like you and like me too, but just people who can really help mamas learn how to actually heal their bodies after birth. And I feel like this is just such a big hole in healthcare that we need to try to correct. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that in just the same way like that I teach about the physical side of it, the nutrition aspect and the really caring for your physiology, like you teach that piece as well. It is all related. And when we have these women that have this sense of like, I've been cleared, I'm good, I should feel good, maybe I'll feel better if I go for a run. Like, we are just setting women up for ongoing negative issues, unfortunately. So I can define a little bit some of the main issues that I end up seeing in women who, after they have had a baby, and generally fall into three sort of categories. The first is abdominal separation or diastasis recti, which luckily now is more well known. When I had my first child and I had this, it really wasn't talked about as much. But basically, that is when you have your six-pack abs, and when you're pregnant and you're growing a baby, those muscles have to separate. They have to separate so that the baby has room to grow. So every pregnant woman has some level of abdominal separation. It's normal in pregnancy. But when those muscles separate, the connective tissue that connects them gets thinner and weaker. So then when you have your baby, for some women, they will just naturally, sort of the connective tissue it thickens back up, the abdominal muscles come back together, and they heal fine. However, for many women, it's up to, statistics show it's about like 30% of women, at least in the US, still have a level of separation at a year postpartum. So the implications of that are, if you have weak, thin connective tissue, if the abdominal muscles aren't coming back together, well, then you have core weakness. And that can create issues like back pain. The core also stabilizes the pelvis, so it can create hip issues. The core works in connection with the pelvic floor. So you can also have, oh, I've got this diastasis, I also have pelvic floor issues. So that is a very common issue. And it is also, again, one that can be exacerbated by doing things that really push pressure out onto your belly. Things like crunches and sit-ups and some, big back bends and yoga. Those can really take you in the wrong direction, right? I want these muscles to come back together, but instead I'm doing things that take them apart. That's not ideal. So that is one main issue that I see. Pelvic floor issues are also extremely common. And this is one that a lot of people joke about, right? Like, oh, you can't go on a trampoline because you're going to pee your pants and all of that. But in reality, we shouldn't. I mean, it's fine, we can joke about it, but it is a sign that some part of the system isn't working well. And very often people will think, oh, I'm leaking, I must have weakness, I then should do more Kegels. And that's not always the case. Pelvic floor issues can be caused by either just weakness and sort of underactive muscles, or they can be caused by overactivity and muscles that are constantly clenching. Both of those issues can result in leaking. And if you have overactive muscles, doing something like a Kegel will actually make the issue worse. So it's very important if you're someone who's like, oh, I've got some pelvic floor stuff going on, you want to figure out sort of what is the root cause of it, right? The symptom is, oh, I've got leaking, I have some of this sense that this isn't working properly. What is the root cause? Is it that your muscles are weak, or are they working really, really hard when they don't necessarily need to? Other pelvic floor issues that can happen are prolapse. So that is literally when an organ will begin, the pelvic floor muscles aren't strong enough to support the internal organs, and things will start descending out of the body. It can be painful. It can prevent your muscles, pelvic floor muscles, from contracting fully. It can be obviously very problematic. And again, that can be a function of tightness. It can be a function of weakness in the muscles, but it also can be a function that, like, you're just not, the system isn't working well, right? It's all related. So whenever I'm talking about one muscle, it's never really about just that one muscle. The core and the pelvic floor all work together. And then the other issue that I see that almost no one speaks about, I don't know why, is hip issues. And hip issues are shockingly common among postpartum women. And part of that is because the core and the pelvic floor stabilize the pelvis. So if you have any sort of weakness, or the system of the core and the pelvic floor aren't quite in balance, then the pelvis can be extra loosey-goosey and it can cause pain, or it can get really tight to try and stabilize. So those are three areas where I see a lot of issues arising. I'll stop if you have any questions on that before.
Yeah, I actually do. So I'm curious about diastasis recti. This is a personal question.
Yeah.
Where I recommend belly binding during that 6-week postpartum period. And I was wondering, do you know if it's a good thing or not a good thing to have your belly wrap on if you were doing some exercises to help diastasis recti?
Yeah, it's a great question. So people feel very strongly about belly binding, like one way or another. And I tend to be pro belly binding in general. I think that especially in those first few weeks postpartum, you have no support from your muscles. Like, give yourself the support. It can be so good physically, also the emotional sort of security of feeling like you have that stability there. That's very, very important. And then I also recommend belly binding for people who maybe didn't do it at the beginning, and maybe they're a few months out or a few years out, and they do have a rather significant diastasis and they're trying to do some rehabilitation work. I will recommend short-term splinting for that purpose. And I recommend that they do wear it while they are doing their exercises. The reason for that is the splint can act as a tool to help increase that sort of mind-body connection. And so when wearing that splint and trying to find the deepest muscles in the core, it's called the transverse abdominis, having that belly binder on can help you find those muscles a little bit easier, because it has already brought the two sides of the abdominals together. It's giving you that little bit of support, so you don't have to work as hard to get the muscles on. So in general, I do recommend that you wear it while you're doing your exercises, but I always want people to know that belly binding is not something that you should have to be doing for years at a time. It's a short-term solution while you get those core muscles back online, while you're retraining them, so that then you can gently wean off the splint and your body can support you, because that's really the ultimate goal, that your core muscles are what end up supporting you. Yeah, it's a
Great.
good question.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. That was a great conversation.
Yeah.
So since we're still on the topic of diastasis recti, I had another question. So how do you know if you have diastasis recti? And also, how do you know if it's been healed?
Yeah.
And then what kind of exercises might you recommend to do and to avoid?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I have a blog post that maybe we can link to, where there's a self-test video so that they can walk through it, because I realize if I unplug my headphones to walk through it, it's going to be noisy with your voice.
Okay. Sure.
But basically it involves, so the interesting thing about diastasis is that there is actually no clinical diagnosis for it. There's no like established, like, this is what you meet these criteria, you have a diastasis. There's some sort of generally accepted notions of it. So I'll talk about those. But the way that it's done is basically you lie down on the ground, you bend your knees, place your feet flat on the floor, and then you just lift your head up just a tiny bit, just to the point where you get these muscles to engage. And you want to measure the separation in 3 areas. You want to do it at the belly button. Here, I can sit up. So you're going to do it here. See how much space you get between the 2 sides of the abdominals at the belly button. 3 fingers above the belly button, so in your upper abdominals, and then 3 fingers below, so in your lower abdominals. And you measure the gap that you feel between the 2 sides of the rectus abdominis in finger widths. So some people will have, I can fit 2 fingers in. Sometimes people need to use 2 hands to measure the size of the gap. So it can be relatively significant, especially for someone who's had twins or they've had multiple pregnancies. Often over time, the diastasis will become bigger if it's not addressed. So you look at the gap in those 3 places, and it can be different. Some people will have it completely closed at the top and the bottom and just a gap at the belly button. It can come in lots of different varieties. Generally, it is said that 2 fingers or less in a postpartum woman is considered closed. But I would say we can get it, you can work to get it less than that. And many people are able to get it smaller than 2 fingers postpartum. Interestingly, the size of the gap is actually less important than the integrity of the connective tissue between those 2 sides. So when you stick your fingers in to measure, you also want to get a sense of, what does it feel like? Like, what's the resistance underneath my fingers? And in healthy connective tissue, it'll feel like silly putty. Like, you'll push, but you'll get resistance and you won't be able to sink your fingers in very much. When the connective tissue is thinner and weaker, it feels weaker, and it feels almost like saran wrap or cellophane, and you can literally stick your fingers in pretty deep. And some people can even feel like stuff moving inside of their belly because they are able to stick their fingers so deep inside of their core that they're touching internal organs. So even people who have like a relatively small gap, if you have very thin connective tissue, that's a sign that your core is likely not functioning well. So I mentioned, like, there's no official sort of diagnosis for diastasis. So I tend to say, if you have a big gap, if you have really thin connective tissue, or if you just feel like your core doesn't work well, like you kind of feel like a limp noodle when you sit around. Like that was me when my daughter was born. I was like unable to sit upright because I just was so weak in my midsection. If you have back pain all the time, those are signs that the core is not supporting you in the way that you need it to. And so then it makes sense to pursue some sort of rehabilitation. And I'll talk about what we can do. Do you have any questions on that before I move on? I don't want to just keep blabbing.
Oh yeah. No, I don't. You're good. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So the question always is like, okay, so where do we start? What do we do? And interestingly, but also kind of makes sense for the body, regardless of the issue that you're facing, the first step is always going to be the same, to bring the body back to balance. And that is really the way I conceptualize it. Like your pregnancy acts like, people sometimes don't like it when I say this, but it acts like an injury to the body. It's very natural, very normal. I think it's a beautiful process. And it takes your muscles and puts them out of balance, just like it would if you sprained your ankle. And so the work that we need to do is to bring the muscles back into balance so that everything can function the way it's supposed to. So the starting place for that balance begins with your breathing. And that's not always what people think. People are like, oh, I need to be doing crunches, I need to be doing things like that. But really where you need to start is your breath, because the breath system is completely connected to the core muscles and the pelvic floor muscles. They work as a unit. And when you are pregnant, your belly, right, expands. There's a baby there. You can't breathe well. It's just, when you're in your third trimester and you're walking up a flight of stairs and you're like, at the end, you are so unable to breathe. Well, for many women, their breath doesn't just return to normal after they have a baby. They have to retrain the breath process. So the key part in breathing is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is this big muscle that connects to the front of the ribs. It wraps, it goes like cuts all the way through your body and wraps all the way around to the back ribs as well. It's this big flat muscle. And when you breathe in, normally in like a normal healthy body, you breathe in, the diaphragm drops down into the belly. It causes the belly to expand a little bit and the muscles to relax of the core a little bit. And it causes the pelvic floor muscles, right? The diaphragm's pushing down, that causes the pelvic floor to then also drop down and stretch. Okay, so it's this natural, as you breathe in, the core and the pelvic floor stretches. And that stretching action then sets those muscles up. When you exhale, or when you, oh, I did that wrong. When you inhale, did I say that? When you inhale, the diaphragm drops down, everything relaxes. When you exhale, right, the diaphragm pulls up. It naturally causes the pelvic floor to pull up and contract, and the core muscles to pull in and contract. And very often for women, after they've had a baby, because their core is so weak, they almost bypass the diaphragm completely and they just breathe right into their belly. So a lot of people will be doing this belly breathing, where instead of taking a breath in and feeling their ribs expand and the diaphragm drop down, they just go right into the belly, right? And then the belly is pushing out and in on every breath, and it actually makes the core weaker over time. So the first step is to just allow yourself to find deep breathing again, which I know does not feel like you're doing enough, but in many ways, it's like the perfect postpartum activity. You can do it when you're laying in bed. You can do it when you're nursing a child. It's going to calm you down because it turns on your parasympathetic nervous system and it starts reconnecting you to your core and your pelvic floor. Once you've done that, then you can start bringing in some gentle core engagement into the process. So for example, if you take a deep breath in, you want to think about your ribs moving left to right and not just taking it into your belly. Then when you breathe out, you can just think about imagining it's not like a big, oh, I'm like contracting my belly. It is this subtle sense that there is a corset muscle wrapping around from the back of the body all the way to the front. And as you breathe out, that corset just tightens a little bit, and you should feel taller and longer. That's the sign. I don't know, whenever I talk about that, whoever I'm talking to always is like, I'm up, I'm sitting. That is the sign that you have turned on the deepest muscles in your belly, the transverse abdominis. Those muscles act like a corset. They support the body. They help bring the muscles together. They can help the connective tissue heal. So you work with the breath, you breathe in, you let everything relax, let the diaphragm drop down, you breathe out, just a gentle engagement to find those deep core muscles and find yourself getting taller and longer. That's truly the first step of getting reconnected to those muscles, because that really is the process. It's that through the process of pregnancy, you just lose the connection to them. And so we've got to reboot the system. We've got to find those muscles again. And then what to avoid is things that put too much pressure out on that weak connective tissue, or things that pull your muscles this way. So things like planks, crunches, those can put too much pressure out on a core when you don't have that connection to your deep core muscles. In yoga, a lot of the back bending postures like upward facing dog or wheel pose, those can pull the muscles in the wrong direction. And also sometimes some deep twist positions. I find that those can also really sort of pull the muscles in the wrong direction and just continue to make those that connective tissue stay thin and weak.
Awesome. I love that. Something that a lot of postpartum mamas that I work with tend to say is that they feel really disconnected from their bodies. And so I feel like this is such a wonderful tip. And the beginning of that, like reconnection, connecting with your breath is always really the best and first place where you can really just kind of regain your center again. And I love that's all of the core muscles, and like how you explain that with the breath. That seems like a gem. I love it. Thank you for mentioning that.
You're welcome. It's a beautiful system. It really is. And I think that like often we don't even appreciate the complexity of it. Like as you work harder, you breathe harder, which causes the muscles to contract more. It's like this system is perfectly aligned if we allow it to be. And if we, again, just remind the body of the way it's designed to work. It's like remembering the way the system knows how to work. It just needs to be reminded of that. And that point about so many women feeling disconnected from their body, I do think that is, it's such a good point, and it is such a commonality that I find in the women that I work with too. I do like to direct people to not just, the breathing helps and the physical part helps too, but also just mentally kind of shifting your awareness down into that area. And then giving compassion. When I first started teaching it, I would always talk about, let's find gratitude for that area. But so many women have such strong feelings held in that area of either fear or trauma. And so gratitude can sometimes be hard to find, but if you can, I always like to use the analogy of like a real life relationship, right? Like so many of us are giving our bodies the silent treatment, which when I do that with my husband, it doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well at all. But if I can think about, okay, I'm in relationship with this body, and I'm in relationship with this part of my body. When my kid is not behaving the way I want him or her to, it doesn't help to just be angry. I have to like find compassion and recognize like they're seeking something, some level of care, some something from me. And if we can start giving that to our own bodies, and especially to the core of the womb area, it's very powerful just to reconnect and reestablish that connection between you and your body.
Yeah, totally. That's
Yeah.
great. Okay. So I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
So is it possible to have an overactive and an underactive pelvic floor at the same time that could possibly cause something like, like a leaking bladder and constipation at the same time?
Yes. So it is 100% possible that you can have asymmetries in the muscle tone in the pelvic floor. And very often, when women have hip issues, it is often related to one side of the pelvic floor being tight. So that is possible. However, it's also possible that both of those issues are caused by overactivity of the pelvic
Mm.
floor. So I can speak to both of those. So first, the easier one, they're both caused by the same issue. So as I mentioned, right, leaking, many people think, oh, I'm leaking, I must have weakness in my pelvic, I must have an underactive pelvic floor. But in fact, leaking is very likely to happen in overactive pelvic floors too. And if you think about why, right, a muscle can only contract fully from a rested position. So I would like to use the example of if I'm bending my arm and I'm holding like a 10-pound weight here. Now my bicep is working. And then after 5 minutes, I'm asked to lift the weight. It's like never going to happen because this muscle is worn out, right?
Mm.
If, however, I'm starting from a fully relaxed position and I'm asked to lift the weight, that's easier. As long as I come down and fully relax it every time, then the muscle is prepared to then again contract. In a pelvic floor that is constantly at some level of contraction, same thing. The muscle's already working, and then you sneeze, and the muscle can't contract to protect against the force of that sneeze, and you leak. So leaking can be overactivity or underactivity of the pelvic floor. And so it's very possible that if you have constipation and you leak, you may just have all the muscles of the pelvic floor are working too hard. Interesting note, often people who have overactive pelvic floors tend to be a little more type A in general. They're a little more high strung, and their bodies also manifest that, right? They have a little bit more tension in their whole body. So that could be the cause of it. However, it is also very common where people have differences in the pelvic floor. This could be because of damage during birth, injury, or even if you had stitches after you gave birth. Scar tissue from the stitches can change the way that muscles contract. And so that could be an issue. But very often people will have one side that is really tight and then the other side ends up being very weak. Or it could be like a front back difference. So it's possible if they're constipated, they're tight in the back and leaking in the front, that could be the pattern. Like they're just weak in the front and tight in the back. That said, there's also a lot about our body positioning and our pelvis positioning that also impacts the way those pelvic floor muscles work. And so if you think about kind of how your pelvis is just stacked when you're sitting, and I swear, if you saw me all day, I promise I am not perfectly aligned and or using my core all day. But if you tuck your pelvis and kind of roll back onto your tailbone, right? So that's gonna make you slouch down. Then you try and do a Kegel, like try and squeeze your pelvic floor. You are going to access the back of your pelvic floor muscles. That's not going to prevent you from leaking at all. If you take it the other direction and now you untuck, and so now you're sitting at the front of your pelvic floor, more towards the pubic bone, now go to Kegel. Now you are accessing the front of the pelvic floor. more than the back. These are the muscles that help you stop leaking. So it could, likely it's like a muscular issue, that there is some sort of level of imbalance, but also simply on the toilet, making sure that you are not tucked and rounded on the toilet, shutting off and squeezing those pelvic floor muscles in the back can help just make a bowel movement easier, because you've opened up the muscles a little bit more simply by positioning your pelvis differently.
Mhm.
But yeah, I find pelvic floors, not most everyone, I think it's getting more, people are getting more aware of the fact that there can be hyperactivity these days. But very often when people are struggling with pelvic floor issues, there is, at least in some part, some level of hyperactivity in it. Yeah.
So how do you deal with that if you have like, say a weak front of the pelvic floor and an overactive back?
Yeah.
How do you
It's a
deal with
good
that?
question. Yeah. Well, so part of it comes down to finding your breath and making sure that when you're doing your breathing, that you aren't tucking or untucking. You're like really neutral, so that when you take that big breath in, it can relax all the muscles of the pelvic floor and not keep one part tight, right? Like if I take a deep breath in, but I am tucking, my diaphragm can't drop down in the back, which means it's not going to be stretching the back of the pelvic floor muscles too. So you want to really, when you're doing your breathing, make sure that you're like upright. The other thing that you can do is also, you can like send the breath specifically into the pelvic floor. So as an example, if you do you know happy baby position in yoga? I can show it real
I
quick.
don't.
It's like you lay down and then you take your legs sort of this way, or you can just like squeeze them in. Whew. Sorry. But just doing that and then taking deep breaths, you can like really send the breath into that area. And then something that I think is very helpful is using a tool to help release the areas that are very tight. So like a pelvic floor massage tool, or even your finger. Very often people will have, especially if they've had some level of trauma during birth and or stitches, they will have adhesions and scar tissue that really makes it hard to get the muscles to release. And so using pelvic floor massage tool, which is just like this wand that you can use and massage those areas, it can help break up that scar tissue, release the adhesions, and allow those muscles to get back to their normal contraction and relaxation patterns.
Awesome. Thank you. So I feel like the next question I should ask is just, I get a lot of questions about also posture for breastfeeding, and so if you're, you know, it's it's hard to necessarily for mamas just to be in an upright position all the time, and there is a lot of like mid and upper back weakness, or just like from carrying the baby and nursing, and just like muscle tiredness and pain and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, just I guess what do you recommend for that? And also, is there any kind of like exercises to help strengthen the mid to upper body, and to so that there isn't this constant, I mean, I know I personally experienced that. It's true that, I had my baby 18 years ago, and before that I used to be a figure skater, and I had like the super perfect posture. I'd always get made fun of because of that. So I'd be like
Right.
super perfect. And but then after I had my baby at 22, ever since then, it's true. I've had like pain in between the shoulder blades a lot. And but I felt like it started when I was just nursing my baby all the time, just kind of like hunched over like this. And it never quite went away. And so I was just wondering, as far as like how to, what is your advice for being able to stay straight and have, be in the center of the pelvic floor, and then
Yeah.
also,
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it is such an issue. I think we all, especially those first few years, we're just spending so much time rounded. So when we're in this position all the time, what ends up happening is the muscles up here get really short, and then the muscles back here get really long, and they both get weak, basically, right? Like constantly contracted and weak, constantly lengthened and weak. So we get tight here, and this causes this position, which it impacts everything. Like the way you walk through the world, it impacts the way you feel about yourself and everything. So it is something that, as much as possible, we want to try and shift that balance a little bit. And it will also then help all your breathing, because if we're like this, it's really hard to get a big deep breath and use your diaphragm because the alignment is off. So I really like to have, here, maybe I'll unplug for a second so I can show this on the mat. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I like to do on just a foam roll like this. Put this down. Where you can we're gonna just open up this part of the body passively. You can lay down on the foam roll, take your hands behind your head, and then allow them to open. And it's just a really nice way to open this up. And you can like bring them back and try and really slowly open them. Because the slower you open them, the more you're relaxing everything. So that's a good way to open the front. And then when you get to sort of strengthening the back body, a really simple exercise, just a corrective exercise, it's called either prisoner or angel. It depends on if you're an optimist or a pessimist. But you come against a wall with your arms wide, and you're going to just take the arms up. I'm bringing my hands basically together in front of me and slide them down, keeping the arms connected to the wall. Just really helps to work all the little muscles that here tend to get so weak. So that's just a really nice way to kind of balance out the two sides. And then the other thing is really noticing head position. So often when people feel really rounded like that, what they end up doing is pulling the shoulders down and out. And this actually kind of juts the head forward, and it can actually create more tightness. And so it's like you think you're in good posture, but what you're really now doing is just flaring the ribs forward. That also makes it hard to breathe. So instead, really keeping the upper body kind of as it was, and then imagine there's some juicy conversation going on behind you and you want to hear it with everything you have in you, and you just like, like eavesdrop a little bit backwards. And that is so much better than this dropping the shoulders down and back. It just stacks the body so much better and helps make your breathing work a lot better.
That's a really good tip. I feel like I do lean forward a lot.
Yeah, we all do. We all do, for sure.
I like that. And I like this exercise too. I feel like I could use that. I'm going to definitely try that.
Yeah, it's so simple, and you could do it anywhere. Yeah, that part of the body tends to get really neglected. Also, the other thing is like for posture, deep breathing. I know I like sound like a broken record, but deep breathing is so key, because very often part of the issue for women, because their core doesn't work well. If your core doesn't work well, as I mentioned, sometimes you just breathe in straight into your belly instead of using your diaphragm. But the other thing that can happen is that instead of breathing into your ribs and using your diaphragm, what people will do is use their secondary muscles of their shoulders and their neck, and they'll go with every breath. Or like if they're told to take a deep breath, they do it this way. So you can imagine over time, every breath all day long, like these muscles are going to be just on fire because they're working so hard. So the more you can keep your shoulders relaxed, breathe into the ribs, the more that is also going to help relax the tension that you're holding in your upper body.
Oh my God, I swear, I feel like you're talking like directly to me. I must do that. I'm
I
sure I
mean,
do that.
I have done this for a little while. I do see the patterns that people have. You're not alone for sure.
Oh my God. Oh, this is awesome. I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Oh, I love it. It's like I could talk about this stuff all day long. I do, basically.
Yeah. Nice. I can see that. All right. Well, let's see. I think I have one more question. Um, so is there any different that somebody who has a C-section should be doing with any of these exercises? Anything that they should be aware of when they start moving again? And how can they help heal the muscles after, after the incision is healed?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So, in general, the principles of healing are the same for a C-section birth and a vaginal birth. Often people will think like, oh, I had a C-section, so my pelvic floor should be fine. And it's really not that's the case. Often the pelvic floor issues happen during pregnancy. I mean, some people will have some issues also during birth, but very often the weakness or the tightness in the pelvic floor happens as a result of pregnancy and the weight on the pelvic floor, not from the actual way that the baby was born. So in general, the principles are the same. You want to get your breathing back. You want to get your core engagement back. You want to pay attention to how you're holding your body so that you can breathe and engage well. The one thing that is additional for C-section folks is that you will really want to do some massaging and mobility of the scar. Scar tissue is a fascinating thing. It's like a living, breathing organism, and it can literally go down into the deepest layers of the muscles, and it can prevent the muscles from firing effectively. There's even some research studies that show that a scar tissue massage on your belly can impact what's going on in your shoulders. So the body is this big sheath, it's all connected. So if something is constricted in one area, it's going to have impacts throughout the whole body. So with scar tissue mobilization and massage, you can get, some oil on your hands, and you just, once it has healed, you start taking it in your hand and rolling it and making sure that that top layer of the scar doesn't get adhered to the bottom layers, and it can kind of always move freely. That is going to be really helpful. It will help prevent abdominal pain. Some people end up having pain from their scar or in the belly that they don't recognize is from the scar. And it will help ensure that the muscles can engage effectively as well as possible.
Awesome. Yeah, something that I recommend is doing castor oil. It's really good for breaking up scar tissue and doing a hot water bottle over that, and just that really can help.
Yeah, and
minimize
so
that.
soothing too, because I know a lot of people are like, the idea of touching my scar makes me queasy. And so, yeah, the more you can make it like a very, nurturing experience and ritual, the better, for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I am just like feel like I've gained so much value and so much like things that I can even use. I have to go see how my abdominals are doing. I don't know
Right.
that I've ever actually checked that. So I'm definitely going to do that. But yeah, I'm just curious if like for those who are interested in learning more or learning more from you, how can they do that?
Yeah. Well, you can come to my website. I've got lots of blog posts and education on there. And if you're interested in learning how to practice yoga well with a diastasis, there's a free masterclass that you have the link, you'll share the link for, I'm sure. A free masterclass on that. I have a free masterclass on happy hips. So if you're someone who is struggling with hip issues like SI joint pain, IT band pain, sciatica, those things are basically addressed in that free masterclass. And then I have online programs there as well, pelvic floor program, a core program, and a hip program. So you can reach out to me via email to Catherine@BRB Yoga if you have any questions.
Hey, this is so exciting. Thank you so much for joining
Oh,
and
thank you
being a
for,
part of this. I really appreciate it. And I feel like I just give so much thanks for what you're doing and helping mamas the way that you are. It's so valuable. And I'm really glad that you're doing that.
oh, thank you so much for having me. And I feel the same. I think that especially catching mamas, like, soon after they have had their baby and really giving them the support that they can't find elsewhere is so, so important. So thank you for all that you are doing as well.